everyone! Welcome back to the Book Nook, the channel where we work on our reading and writing goals together. Speaking of goals, the Storytelling Festival is coming up, so I'm checking in on my goal, reading at least 6 stories from different cultures for inspiration. We crushed it! We've read a bunch of traditional literature, myths, fables, and folktales, and soon I'll get started writing my very own traditional tale. So my friend Justin and I were hanging out, and he was asking me about some of the stories I've read. At first I thought, this'll be easy, I've read so many. But then, as I started explaining, I realized something. How do I decide what's most important to tell him? Do I talk about every little thing that happens? Do I just tell him the ending? What if I leave out something important? That got me thinking. Since I'll be going to the festival and talking about these stories even more, I want to make sure I can share them in a way that really captures what makes them great. How do we decide what's important in a story? This is the perfect time to figure that out together. All right. So if I want to tell someone about these stories in a way that really captures what makes them great, I need to figure out what's most important. I need to summarize. Think back to when we summarized informational texts. We focused on the main idea and key details, just enough to capture what the author wanted us to know. How can what we learned about summarizing nonfiction help us to summarize stories? You might remember from summarizing nonfiction that it's important to have the right level of detail. That's the same with stories. Let's say my friend asks me to tell him about a story I just read, The Fisherman and the Genie. Maybe I'd say, it's about a fisherman who finds a bottle with a genie inside. And what do you think he'd say? Probably, yeah, I gathered that much from the title. Tell me more. But what should I share next? Should I tell him every single thing that happens from start to finish? That might take a while and spoil all the good parts of the story. But if I stuck with just that one sentence, I'd totally leave out what makes the story special. It's definitely important to know how much detail to share, right? That's where summarizing comes in. Summarizing helps us give just the right amount of detail. Now, the details of nonfiction texts and stories are kind of different. Stories aren't just facts and information, after all. So what kinds of details might we have to think about and include when we summarize a story? Pause here to write down your thoughts. Since stories unfold through characters, settings, problems, and resolutions, these are the things we need to include that make a summary clear and meaningful. But how do we actually put those key pieces together in a way that makes sense? Let's practice with a strategy called SCAR. Yeah, kind of a silly name, but it can really help us remember the elements we want to include in our summary. Setting, characters, action and adversity, and resolution. The action and adversity part is just another way of thinking about the story events and conflict. You know, the challenge the characters face. This strategy will help us pull out the most important details as we summarize one of my favorite stories, The Flight of Icarus. Long ago in ancient Greece, Daedalus, a brilliant inventor, and his son Icarus were imprisoned on the island of Crete by King Minos. Desperate to escape, Daedalus studied the birds and devised a plan to build wings using feathers and wax. He carefully crafted a pair for himself and another for Icarus. Before taking off, Daedalus gave his son strict instructions. Fly at a steady height. Fly too low, and the mist from the sea would make the feathers too heavy. Fly too high, and the sun's heat would melt the wax. They soared high above the sea, finally free. Icarus was thrilled by the sensation of flying. He soared over and above the clouds, enjoying his freedom and his flight. Overwhelmed with excitement, he ignored his father's warning, climbing higher and higher toward the sun. Daedalus called out to Icarus, but he was too far away to hear. As Daedalus watched in horror, the wax in Icarus's wings began to melt. Icarus frantically tried to keep flying, but his wings failed him, and he tumbled from the sky. Daedalus, devastated, continued on alone, safely reaching the island of Sicily. Though he had finally escaped Crete, he would forever mourn the loss of his beloved son. I know what you might be thinking. This is one of my favorite stories. Well, I know it's kind of a bummer at the end, but it has a good lesson, and I love how creative Daedalus is. Okay, anyway, regardless of whether you liked the story or not, let's try summarizing using the SCAR strategy, leaving our opinions out and including those key story elements: setting, characters, action or adversity, and resolution. Take a moment to fill out whichever elements of the story you can identify. Here's what I came up with. Setting. Where and when does this story take place? The island of Crete in ancient times. Characters. Who is the story about? Daedalus and Icarus. Action adversity. What happens? What challenge do they face? Daedalus and Icarus escape Crete using wings made of feathers and wax. Icarus flies too close to the sun and destroys his wings. Resolution. How is the conflict resolved? How does the story end? Icarus dies. Daedalus survives but is heartbroken to lose his son. All right, key details captured. Now we can put it all together in flowing sentences. Here's our summary. Daedalus and his son Icarus were trapped on Crete, so Daedalus invented wax and feather wings to escape. He warned Icarus not to fly too high, but Icarus ignored him. The sun melted his wings and he fell into the sea. Daedalus survived, but lost his son. Notice how we didn't write down every detail? We left out how Icarus soared above and over the clouds. We don't need to say that Daedalus called out to Icarus. Those are interesting details for sure, but not necessary for a summary. My summary captures the key story elements, those most important details that someone would need to know to understand what happens in the story. Summarizing literary stories is an important skill, not just for reading, but for real life too. At the Storytelling Festival, I want to share stories in a way that's clear and interesting, and summarizing this way will help me do that. The best part? There are actually a few strategies we can use to summarize stories. There's not one right way to do it. It's really up to you which strategy feels the most helpful. In your PDF, you'll find some other options for summarizing literature. Each strategy captures the key details of a story, and using any of them can help create a great summary. Be sure to practice using one or two of them. You can summarize The Flight of Icarus in a new way or practice with another favorite. Whether you're retelling a traditional tale, sharing a favorite book with a friend, or even creating your own story, knowing how to focus on the most important details will help you bring stories to life. Thanks for joining me today. Until next time, keep reading and keep working on those goals.